There is something that has been with you your entire life. It was there when you were a child lying awake at night, turning the events of the day over and over in your mind. It was there when you made your first real mistake, when you said something you wished you could unsay, when you walked away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it. It has been your most constant companion, more reliable than any friend, more persistent than any enemy. And yet, most people go their entire lives without ever truly examining it. It is the voice inside your head, not the voice that tells you to drink water or reminds you of an appointment, not the practical, mechanical voice of daily function. The other one, the one that seems to watch everything you do and then report back to you with its own interpretation. The one that takes a single awkward moment and somehow stretches it across days. The one that wakes up with you in the morning and is still speaking when you are trying to fall asleep at night. Most people assume that voice is just who they are, that what it says is simply what is true, that its judgments are accurate, its conclusions are reliable, and its tone, however harsh, is somehow deserved. And because of that assumption, they never question it. They never step back and wonder whether that voice might be wrong, distorted, or simply a habit that was formed long ago, under circumstances that no longer apply. This is where most of the unnecessary suffering in a human life begins. Not in the actual events, not in the real failures or the real losses, but in the story that gets told about those events afterward, by that voice in the privacy of your own mind, where no one else can hear it and where you have no reason to defend yourself against it. The ancient Stoics understood something about this that most modern people are only beginning to rediscover. They knew and wrote about with remarkable clarity that the human mind has a peculiar tendency to do something far more damaging than simply experience pain. It has the tendency to manufacture pain, to extend it, to give it meaning it does not inherently carry, and then to treat that manufactured meaning as though it were a fact about the world. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and spent the early years of his life with no control over his physical circumstances whatsoever, arrived at an insight that changed the way an entire civilization thought about the inner life. He said that men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. A simple sentence, almost deceptively simple, but the implications of it reach into every corner of how you live, how you think, how you treat yourself, and how you move through the world. What he was pointing at was this: the event and your interpretation of the event are two entirely different things. And while you may have very little control over the first, you have far more control over the second than you have ever been taught to believe. Let that settle for a moment. Because it is not a small idea, it is actually one of the most significant ideas a human being can encounter. And the reason it tends to slide past without landing is that the voice in your head is extraordinarily good at making its interpretations feel like facts. It does not say, "Here is my opinion about what just happened." It says, with quiet certainty, "Here is what just happened. Here is what it means. Here is what it says about you." And because it sounds like a fact, you treat it like one. Think about the last time something went wrong. Not something catastrophic, just something ordinary and human. Maybe you gave a presentation and stumbled over your words in one section. Maybe you sent a message and immediately regretted the way you phrased it. Maybe you were in a conversation and said something that landed badly, and you could see it in the other person's expression. Maybe you set a goal for yourself and then fell short of it, again, in the way that feels particular to you because it keeps happening. The moment passed. It was over in seconds or minutes. The other people involved moved on, forgot about it, turned their attention to the next thing in their day. But inside your mind, something different was happening. That voice picked up the event like a stone and began to examine it. It turned it over. It looked at it from different angles. It compared it to other similar stones it had collected over the years, and then it began to build something with them. That thing it builds is a story, and the story is almost always the same story, with only the specific details changing each time. The story goes something like this. This happened because of something fundamentally wrong with you. And the evidence for what is fundamentally wrong with you is this moment, and the other moment from 3 years ago that you still haven't fully forgiven yourself for. They are all connected, says the voice. They all point to the same thing, and that thing is the reason you have not yet become who you were supposed to be. It is a remarkably convincing story, and the most unsettling part of it is not that the voice tells it. It is that you listen. You listen not because you are weak or because you are foolish. You listen because you were never taught any other way to respond. You were never given the tools to step back from that voice and ask, very simply, is this true? Is this interpretation accurate? Is this the only way to understand what happened? Or is this just one possible reading of events produced by a mind that has certain habits and certain fears, and that is doing what minds do, which is generating explanations constantly? Whether those explanations are accurate or not, the mind is a meaning-making machine. It cannot help it. It is what the mind does. Every experience that enters your awareness gets processed through layers of memory, emotion, belief, expectation, and self-concept. And what comes out the other side is not the raw experience itself. What comes out is an interpretation, a story, a constructed version of events that your mind presents to you as though it were simply a recording of what happened. But it is not a recording. It is an editorial. And like any editorial, it reflects the biases and assumptions of whoever is doing the editing. The Stoics were not the only ones who noticed this. Centuries after Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals about the importance of guarding the quality of his thoughts, modern psychology arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through an entirely different route. The field of cognitive behavioral therapy, which has since become one of the most evidence-supported approaches to human psychological well-being, is built almost entirely on a single foundational insight. Our thoughts about events, not the events themselves, determine how we feel and how we behave. The therapeutic process, at its core, involves learning to identify those automatic thoughts, the voices running commentary, and then learning to examine them, question them, and in many cases, replace them with more accurate and useful interpretations. What the Stoics described as philosophy, modern psychology describes as cognition, but they are pointing at the same thing. The human mind's relationship to its own thoughts is not fixed. It is not something you simply have to accept as it is. It is something that can be understood, examined, and fundamentally changed. But here is the thing that rarely gets said clearly enough. This is hard work. Not because it requires anything physically demanding. Not because it requires years of study or access to rare wisdom. It is hard work because it requires you to do something that runs counter to one of the deepest and most automatic tendencies of the human mind, which is to treat your own thoughts as though they are identical to reality. When that voice speaks, it feels like perception. It feels like you are simply seeing things as they are, and stepping back from that feeling, creating even a small amount of space between yourself and what your mind is producing, requires a quality that has to be deliberately cultivated. The Stoics called it different things in different contexts. Sometimes they called it reason, sometimes they called it the faculty of judgment. In our language, we might simply call it awareness, the ability to notice not just what you are thinking, but that you are thinking, and to hold that distinction in your mind long enough to actually do something useful with it. This is where the practice begins. Not with grand declarations of change, not with the decision to become a different kind of person overnight. It begins with the smallest possible act, noticing, just noticing. You're in the middle of your day and something happens that activates that voice. Maybe it is something external, a comment from someone, a setback, an unexpected piece of news that lands badly. Or maybe it is entirely internal. A memory surfaces without invitation. An old regret comes back. A familiar anxiety tightens in your chest without a clear cause. And the voice begins to do what it always does. It starts generating its interpretation. It starts building its story. And instead of immediately following that story down into the place where it always leads, instead of accepting it as reality and letting it determine how you feel and how you act, you pause, just for a moment, long enough to notice that something is happening, that the voice has started, that it is saying something, and that what it is saying is not the same thing as what is actually true. That pause is not nothing. That pause is actually everything, because in that pause lives the entire difference between a life that is controlled by your thoughts and a life that is directed by your choices. In that pause, you are no longer simply the person having the thoughts. You are also the person who is aware that you are having them, and that awareness, that simple, quiet, unglamorous awareness, is the foundation of everything the Stoics were pointing toward. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme again and again in his meditations. What is remarkable about that text, what makes it feel so raw and honest, is that you can see him not describing some elevated state he has permanently attained, but actively practicing this return to awareness in real time, moment by moment, day after day. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world. He had every external reason to feel confident, settled, and above the ordinary turbulence of human psychology. And yet, his private writings are filled with reminders he wrote to himself. Watch your thoughts. Question your impressions. Do not be swept away by the narrative your mind produces. Come back, come back, come back. He needed those reminders because the work does not end. The voice does not simply go quiet one day because you have understood it. It continues to speak. The question is what authority you give it. The question is whether you are the one directing the conversation, or whether you have simply handed the wheel over to a process that runs automatically and does not always have your best interests in mind. Let's spend some time with a specific kind of thought that most people encounter regularly and that causes a disproportionate amount of unnecessary suffering. It is not the dramatic kind of thought, not the thoughts about major life crises or severe failures. It is the mundane kind. The small, persistent, grinding kind that wears on you not through intensity but through repetition. It is the thought that replays a conversation you had. It is the thought that returns to a decision you made 6 months ago and finds new reasons to second-guess it. It is the thought that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a version of something you said in a meeting, slightly worse in the retelling, and holds you there in the dark, turning it over until the anxiety that comes with it makes you feel certain that something is fundamentally wrong. These thoughts are so common that people often don't even register them as significant. They become part of the background noise of being alive, the stream of self-referential commentary that runs beneath everything. And because it is constant, it begins to feel normal. And what feels normal begins to feel necessary. And so people carry these thoughts the way they carry their bodies, not because they have chosen to, but because they have simply never learned that another way is possible. What the Stoics would say, and what careful examination tends to confirm, is that these thoughts are not normal in the sense of being necessary or inevitable. They are common enough that every human tradition has grappled with them in one form or another. But their commonness does not make them unavoidable. It makes them a habit. And habits, by definition, can be changed. The mechanism behind rumination, which is the clinical word for that tendency to replay and reprocess, is not fully mysterious. The mind returns to unresolved events because it is, in some sense, trying to solve them. It is looking for something it did not find the first time. Some resolution, some explanation, some action it could take that would make the discomfort of the original experience go away. The problem is that most of the events the mind returns to are not actually solvable in the way the mind is trying to solve them. The conversation is over. The decision is made. The moment has passed, and the mind replaying it endlessly is not actually producing solutions. It is producing suffering while wearing the costume of problem-solving. This is the particular cruelty of the ruminating mind. It feels productive. It feels like you are doing something. It feels like engagement, like responsibility, like you are taking what happened seriously. But underneath that feeling, what is actually happening is that you are sitting in a room with no doors, examining the same evidence over and over, arriving at the same painful conclusions, and calling that examination useful. The Stoics had a remarkably practical response to this pattern. They did not say, "Stop thinking about it." They knew that instruction would be useless, the same way telling someone not to think about a white bear immediately produces the thought of a white bear. Instead, they asked a different question. They asked, is this within your control or outside of it? This is the fundamental division that runs through all of Stoic philosophy. The dichotomy of control, as Epictetus described it, is the recognition that reality consists of two categories of things that are up to us and things that are not up to us. And the degree to which we suffer unnecessarily is almost perfectly correlated with how much attention we give to the second category while neglecting the first. The past is not up to you. What has already happened is, by definition, outside of your control. The conversation you had, the decision you made, the moment you regret, none of these can be changed by revisiting them. What is up to you is what you do now, what you think now, how you respond to the present moment now. And the present moment is where your life is actually happening, regardless of where your mind might be spending its time. This is not an instruction to ignore the past or to refuse to learn from it. Learning from experience is one of the most valuable things a human mind can do. The Stoics were not against reflection. They were against the kind of reflection that does not actually learn anything, that does not move toward any useful insight or any change in behavior, but simply returns to pain, for pain's sake, as their suffering over what cannot be changed is a form of integrity. Real reflection looks different from rumination. Real reflection is directed. It asks specific questions. What happened? What role did I play in it? What would I do differently with what I know now? What can I take forward from this into future situations? And then, crucially, it ends. It concludes. It draws whatever insight is available and then releases the event back into the past where it belongs, rather than dragging it into the present where it does not belong and where it can only cause harm. The Stoic practice of evening reflection, which Marcus Aurelius described and Seneca wrote about explicitly, was precisely this kind of directed, boundaried examination, not unlimited open-ended rumination, but a structured inquiry that served a specific purpose and ended when that purpose was complete. What did I do today? Where did I fall short of my own standards? What will I do differently tomorrow? And then sleep. The past is done. The future is not yet here. Tonight I rest, and tomorrow I try again. There is something in that simplicity that modern life has largely lost. We live in an environment of relentless stimulation, constant connection, and endless comparison. Every moment of silence that might allow for genuine reflection is quickly filled with something else, a screen, a notification, a stream of information demanding attention. And so the mind, deprived of the healthy kind of directed reflection, tends toward the unhealthy kind of automatic rumination instead. Not because it prefers it, but because it has no alternative. The mechanism that is supposed to process experience and extract meaning from it cannot function the way it is supposed to, and so it runs in circles instead. One of the most important things you can do for the quality of your inner life is simply to give that process the conditions it needs to function well. That means silence sometimes. It means stillness. It means allowing yourself to sit with an experience without immediately burying it under more input. Not forever, not dramatically. Just long enough for the mind to do what it is actually designed to do, which is to process, to integrate, to understand, and then to move forward. But let's return to the voice, because we have been circling it, describing it, examining it from the outside, and now it is time to look more directly at what is actually being said. The content of that inner voice, for most people, tends to cluster around a relatively small number of themes. It speaks about competence, whether you are good enough at what you do, whether you measure up, whether you are where you should be at this point in your life. It speaks about belonging, whether people actually like you, whether you are accepted, whether the image you present to the world matches the reality of what is happening inside. It speaks about worthiness, whether you deserve the good things you have, whether your ambitions are realistic or foolish, whether there is something fundamentally insufficient about you that other people, in their more perceptive moments, can see. These are not random topics. They are the precise places where the human psyche is most vulnerable, most hungry, and most susceptible to distortion. And the voice knows this. not consciously, not with any malicious intent, but in the way that a river knows the path of least resistance. It flows toward these places because these are the places where you care most. And where you care most, you are most likely to interpret ambiguous evidence in the harshest possible direction. Consider what happens when someone in your life does not respond to your message for longer than expected. The event itself is completely neutral. There is no information in it. People are busy. People forget. People have things happening in their lives that have nothing to do with you. But the voice does not present it as a neutral event. It presents it as evidence. Evidence that something has changed. Evidence that they are pulling away. Evidence that maybe what you feared about how they see you is, in fact, true. And the remarkable thing, the thing that reveals how distorting this process is that you cannot know this. You genuinely cannot know it. You have no information. But the voice speaks as though it does. It presents its interpretation not as a guess, not as one possible explanation among many, but as a likely truth. And so you respond to its interpretation as though you are responding to reality. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about working with impressions. An impression is what your mind produces in response to an event. It is the initial interpretation, the first story, the gut reaction. And the crucial move, the one that requires practice and awareness, is to hold that impression at arm's length before accepting it. To ask, is this accurate? Is this the only way to understand what happened? What would this look like to someone who did not share my specific fears and histories and patterns? Epictetus was ruthless about this. He would say, when something presents itself to you as a certain kind of thing, ask yourself what it actually is. Distinguish between the event and your judgment of the event. Keep them separate, because once you blend them, once you allow your interpretation to fuse with the event itself, you have lost the ability to see either one clearly. This is not cold or detached. This is not about becoming someone who does not feel things, who processes everything at a clinical distance, who is immune to pain or disappointment, or the ordinary human grief of things not going the way you hoped. The Stoics were not emotionless. Stoicism has been badly misrepresented in popular culture as a kind of emotional suppression, as though the goal is to feel nothing. That was never the goal. The goal was not to feel less, but to feel accurately, to experience emotions that are proportionate to their causes, to not suffer more than the situation actually warrants, and to not be deprived of genuine joy and connection and meaning by a mind that is too busy manufacturing threats to notice when life is actually good. The emotions that the Stoics valued, and they wrote warmly about joy, about love, about the pleasure of good friendship and genuine work and a life lived with integrity, were emotions that arose from accurate perception, from seeing things as they actually are, not filtered through layers of fear and self-attack and catastrophic interpretation, but as they are in their actual scale and actual meaning. When you see things accurately, you grieve what is actually worth grieving. You worry about what is actually worth worrying about. You feel regret about things you genuinely could have done better, and you do not feel regret about things that were simply the ordinary imperfections of being human. You feel confident where confidence is warranted, and appropriately cautious where caution is warranted. Your inner weather matches the actual weather of your life, rather than being a storm that has very little to do with what is actually happening outside the window. That kind of alignment between your inner experience and reality is what the Stoics were pointing at when they talked about living in accordance with nature, with reason, with the way things actually are. It sounds abstract, but in practice, moment to moment, it is simply the work of not letting your mind convince you of things that are not true, and not allowing it to amplify suffering beyond what the situation actually calls for. So how does this actually happen? Not as a philosophy, not as a concept, but as a lived practice in the specific, concrete, ordinary moments of your days. It begins, always, with that pause. That moment of awareness before the automatic reaction takes over. The gap between the event and the response, which in an unexamined life is so narrow as to be almost non-existent, but which can be widened through practice until it becomes a genuine space in which choice becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to develop an entire approach to psychology based on what he had learned in those conditions, described this space in terms that have stayed with generations of readers. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He was describing from the ruins of the most extreme human suffering imaginable, the same fundamental insight that Epictetus had arrived at from the conditions of slavery. The space is real. The choice is real. And the cultivation of awareness, the practice of widening that space, is among the most fundamentally human things a person can do. But widening that space requires that you notice when it closes, and it tends to close most dramatically in precisely the moments when it matters most. When something activates a deep fear, or touches an old wound, or confirms a story you have been telling yourself for years, the reaction can be almost instantaneous. The voice jumps in before you even register that anything has happened, and suddenly you are 3 steps down a well-worn path of thought before you realize where you are. This is not a failure. This is simply how automatic processes work. They are automatic precisely because they have become so practiced, so deeply grooved, that they run without any conscious input. The solution is not to somehow prevent the automatic process from starting. It is to become skilled at noticing earlier and earlier in the sequence when it has begun, and then from that noticing to choose what comes next. The Stoics used a practice they sometimes called the view from above. The idea was to mentally step back from your immediate situation, from the microscopic closeness of your own perspective, and see it from a wider vantage point. Not to diminish it, not to tell yourself it doesn't matter, but to restore proportion, to see it in the context of a larger landscape, a longer arc of time, a bigger picture than the one that the anxious, suffering mind tends to construct. When the voice is telling you that a particular moment was devastating, that a particular failure is definitive, that a particular social interaction was a disaster from which your reputation cannot recover, the view from above asks, zoom out. If you were looking at this 5 years from now, how would it appear? If you were advising a close friend who had experienced exactly this, what would you tell them? If you removed the specific emotional coloring that your history and fears and self-concept are adding to this event right now, what would remain? Often, what remains is much smaller, not because the experience was not real, not because the feeling of it was not genuine, but because the meaning the voice was attaching to it, the weight it was giving to it, the permanence it was declaring turns out not to survive contact with perspective. This is not denial, this is proportion, and proportion is one of the most healing things a mind can have access to. There is another Stoic practice that is worth examining here, one that gets misunderstood more than almost any other. It is called negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, the premeditatio of adversity. The Stoics recommended spending a small amount of time each day contemplating what could go wrong, not catastrophizing, not dwelling in anxiety, but deliberately and briefly considering the possibility of loss, of failure, of things not going as hoped. This sounds to modern ears like exactly what you should not do if you are trying to cultivate a healthier relationship with your inner voice. It sounds like deliberately feeding the very kind of thinking that causes so much suffering. But the purpose of the practice is precisely the opposite of what it appears. The goal is not to generate anxiety. The goal is to dissolve it. Here is the underlying logic. When you do not allow yourself to think about negative possibilities, when you push them away, avoid them, refuse to look at them directly, they do not disappear. They simply move underground. They operate below conscious awareness, as vague dread, as low-level anxiety, as the unnamed sense that something could go wrong at any moment, which produces a kind of chronic alertness that is exhausting and that distorts your perception of everything. But when you bring them to the surface deliberately, when you look at them clearly and specifically, in a calm and deliberate way, something often remarkable happens. The feared thing, when examined in daylight rather than glimpsed in the dark, turns out to be smaller than the fear suggested. It turns out to be survivable. It turns out that even if the thing you are afraid of were to happen, you would find a way through it. You have resources you were not counting. You have survived hard things before, and in the clear light of deliberate examination rather than anxious avoidance, the worst-case scenario begins to lose its power to disturb you. This is not optimism. The Stoics were not optimists in the way the word is usually used today, the sunny, positive, look-on-the-bright-side approach that refuses to acknowledge difficulty. The Stoics were realists. They believed in looking at things exactly as they are, without addition and without subtraction. And looking at difficulty directly, rather than flinching from it, is one of the ways you stop giving it more power than it deserves. Seneca wrote to a friend in one of his letters, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The person who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." Now, Seneca was not urging morbidity. He was not suggesting that you spend your days in gloomy contemplation of endings. He was pointing at the clarity that comes from genuinely reckoning with impermanence. When you know that things are temporary, truly know it, not just abstractly acknowledge it. The present moment takes on a quality that it does not have when you are operating under the illusion that everything will always be as it is now, and it changes the voice. The voice that spends so much time worrying about reputation, about what people think, about whether the image you project matches the reality of who you are. That voice loses some of its urgency when you hold, even briefly, the awareness that none of it will last forever. What remains, what actually persists through the lens of genuine impermanence, tends to be the things that actually matter. The quality of your presence with the people you love, the integrity with which you do your work, the degree to which, on the ordinary days, you showed up as the person you actually want to be. These are not things the voice tends to spend much time on. The voice tends to focus on the gaps, the shortfalls, the evidence of inadequacy. But when you widen your perspective, when you ask not just what is wrong but what is actually true, the picture that emerges is more complete. And a more complete picture is almost always a less terrifying one. Let's talk about the relationship between this inner work and the outer life, because there is a version of all of this that can become a kind of spiritual self-indulgence, an endless examination of inner states that never moves outward into actual change in actual behavior, in the actual world. And the Stoics would have found that version deeply unsatisfying. For them, philosophy was not an end in itself. It was in service of something. It was in service of a life well lived, and a life well lived was not a life spent in perfect contemplative peace. It was a life engaged with the world, contributing to the world, showing up for the people in your world with as much integrity and clarity and presence as you could manage. Marcus Aurelius was not meditating in a monastery. He was running an empire during a time of war and plague. Epictetus was teaching students, running a school, actively engaging with the problems of human life as they appeared in front of him every day. Seneca was writing, advising, participating in the political life of Rome, even as he grappled privately with the compromises that participation required. The inner work was never separate from the outer life. It was the foundation of it. So when you begin to develop a healthier relationship with the voice in your head, when you start to create that space between the automatic reaction and the chosen response, the effect is not that you withdraw from life. The effect is that you engage with it more fully, because so much of what passes for engagement is actually reaction. It is the automatic response to the automatic stimulus. It is the habitual behavior that comes from the unexamined thought. And when you begin to examine those thoughts, the behavior that follows becomes more deliberate, more chosen, more actually expressive of who you want to be rather than simply reflective of the patterns you happen to develop. This is where real confidence comes from, not from telling yourself you are good enough, though that is sometimes useful, not from accumulating external evidence of success, though that has its role. Real confidence, the kind that is steady rather than fragile, the kind that does not collapse when things go badly, comes from the experience of showing up in a difficult moment and discovering that you can navigate it, from discovering that the voice in your head told you the worst was coming, and the worst came, and you were still standing, from discovering that you have more capacity than the voice suggested, that you are more resilient than the story about you implied, that the gap between who you are and who you need to be is smaller than fear made it appear. And that discovery cannot happen in your head. It can only happen through action, through the decision to do the thing anyway, even when the voice is loud, through the willingness to move forward in the presence of uncertainty without waiting for the voice to give you permission, because the voice, left to its own devices, will rarely give you permission. It will find reasons for caution, for waiting, for one more cycle of evaluation before the step is taken. And life, in the meantime, continues to move. The Stoics understood something about action that runs counter to a very common modern belief. The modern belief goes something like this. First you feel ready, and then you act. First you feel confident, and then you try. First you resolve the internal conflict, and then you move forward into the world. The internal state comes first, and the external behavior follows from it. But the Stoics would have said this gets the order exactly backwards. Confidence does not precede action. It follows from it. Clarity does not come before engagement. It emerges through it. The readiness you are waiting to feel before you begin is something that cannot be manufactured in advance through more thinking, or more preparation, or more rounds of inner evaluation. It can only be discovered by moving, by doing, by stepping into the thing that feels uncertain and finding out, experientially, not conceptually, that you are capable of meeting it. This is not recklessness. It is not the instruction to leap without looking, or to act without thought. The Stoics were careful thinkers. Marcus Aurelius deliberated slowly and wrote extensively before making significant decisions. What they were pointing at was something more specific than simply acting fast. They were pointing at the particular failure mode of the person who has thought enough, who has prepared enough, who genuinely knows enough to begin, but who does not begin, because the voice has convinced them that the preparation is still incomplete, that the conditions are not yet right, that one more round of evaluation will finally produce the certainty that never actually comes from evaluation. There is a form of procrastination that wears the disguise of diligence. It looks like responsibility. It feels like taking things seriously. But underneath it, if you look carefully, what you find is fear. And specifically the fear of beginning, because beginning means the possibility of failing, and failing means the possibility of the voice being right about all the things it has been saying. So as long as you do not begin, you do not fail. And as long as you do not fail, the voice cannot be confirmed. But here is the thing the voice does not tell you about that strategy. Not beginning is its own kind of failure. It is a slower one, a less visible one that does not announce itself dramatically. It happens in the accumulation of days and months and eventually years in which the thing you were going to do remained undone, in which the life you were building toward remained unbuilt, in which the person you were becoming remained perpetually on the verge of becoming, but never quite arrived. The Stoics named this danger explicitly. Seneca, who was himself guilty of the kind of comfortable delay he criticized in others, he wrote about this with remarkable self-awareness, said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The anticipation of the difficulty is almost always worse than the difficulty itself. The voice conjures a version of the challenge that is worse than what actually awaits. And because you have been living inside that conjured version, rehearsing it, feeling its weight, when you actually step into the real thing, it tends to be more manageable than the mind suggested. This is not always true. Sometimes things are genuinely as hard as you feared. Sometimes the failure is real, the disappointment is real. The difficulty is exactly as difficult as it appeared from the outside. But even then, even in the cases where reality confirms the fear, you discover something that the voice had not prepared you for. You discover that you can deal with it, that the coping resources you actually have, the resilience that is actually available to you, are more than the voice's accounting suggested. that you are not as fragile as the fear made you feel. And that discovery, that experiential, lived, undeniable discovery, is worth more than any amount of reassurance the voice could ever offer. The ancient Romans had a phrase that Marcus Aurelius returned to repeatedly in his meditations. Amor Fati, the love of fate, the embrace of what is, not just as something to be tolerated, not just as something to be accepted with grim resignation, but as something to be welcomed, as the raw material of the life you are actually living, which is the only life available to you, and which contains within it, in all its difficulty and uncertainty and imperfection, everything you need to become who you are capable of becoming. This is perhaps the most radical of the Stoic ideas, and it is the one that tends to meet the most resistance. It is easy enough to agree that you should manage your thoughts more carefully, that you should question the voice rather than automatically obeying it, that you should not suffer more than the situation requires. These ideas feel reasonable, practical, manageable. But Amor Fati goes further. It says not only should you not resist what is happening, you should actually find a way to want it, to see even the hard things, the unwanted things, the things you would have chosen differently, as exactly what was needed for your particular path. Friedrich Nietzsche, who borrowed the phrase from the Stoics and made it central to his own philosophy, described it as wanting nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, that is cowardice, but to love it. This is a high standard, probably higher than most people can genuinely reach most of the time. But as a direction, as a practice, as a way of orienting yourself toward your own experience, it points at something genuinely transformative. Because the alternative, the default mode of the unexamined mind, is a life spent in some degree of resistance to what is. A life in which a significant portion of your energy is devoted not to engaging with what is actually here, but to protesting that it should be different, to wishing the past had done differently, to demanding that the present conform to your preferences, to fearing that the future will not deliver what you want, and all of that resistance. All of that friction between what is and what you insist should be, it generates exactly the kind of suffering that the Stoics spent their lives trying to understand and transcend. To practice Amor Fati is not to pretend that difficulty is pleasant. It is not to perform gratitude for things that genuinely hurt. It is something more subtle and more honest than that. It is to recognize that the difficulty is real and that it is also yours. That it belongs to your life in a way that fighting it does not change, but accepting it, truly accepting it, with your whole attention rather than with half your attention while the other half looks for the exit, does change. Not the difficulty itself, but your relationship to it, and your relationship to it is where your experience actually lives. There is a practice that some Stoic writers describe, and that shows up in various forms across different philosophical traditions, which involves very deliberately directing attention toward what is present and available rather than what is absent and refused. Not as a technique for manufactured positivity, not as a way of ignoring what is hard, but as a genuine recognition that the mind tends to have a strong asymmetry in its attention. It notices what is wrong more readily than what is right. It registers threat and lack more quickly than sufficiency and resource. This is not a character flaw, it is an evolutionary feature. The mind that was quick to notice danger and slow to become complacent about threat survived better than the mind that was easily satisfied. But that same asymmetry, which was adaptive in the conditions that shaped it, becomes a source of unnecessary dissatisfaction in conditions where the most relevant challenges are psychological rather than physical. When the threats are not lions but social judgments, not starvation but failure, not death but embarrassment, the same vigilant, threat-detecting mind that would have served your ancestors extremely well can make your ordinary life feel like an ongoing emergency. Deliberately noticing what is working, what is present, what is enough, this is not naive, it is a corrective for a systematic bias. It is the recognition that what the mind reports as reality is always a selected sample, and that by default, the selection is skewed toward difficulty, consciously expanding that sample to include what is stable, what is good, what is already sufficient. This is not denial, It is accuracy. It is a fuller picture, and a fuller picture changes the voice. Not immediately, not permanently, not without ongoing effort, but over time. The voice that has been trained to scan primarily for threat begins with practice and repetition to include other kinds of information in its reports. It begins to notice, because you have been training it to notice, that there are also things that are going well, that there are also things that were handled with care, that there are also things that, by any honest measure, are cause for something approaching satisfaction. This is the gradual work of reshaping the inner narrator, not replacing it, not silencing it, not fighting it, but slowly, persistently, consistently widening what it is willing to include in its account of your experience. Let's think about the social dimension of this, because so much of what the inner voice speaks about is relational. So much of its content involves other people, how they see you, what they think of you, whether they approve of you, whether they are pulling away or moving closer, whether the image you present is matching the reality they perceive. And this makes sense, because human beings are deeply social creatures. Belonging matters to us in a way that goes beyond comfort. It goes all the way down to something that feels like survival, because for most of human history, it was survival. Exclusion from the group was not simply unpleasant, it was dangerous, and the mind evolved to treat social threat with something approaching the same urgency as physical threat. But again, what was adaptive in the conditions that shaped it can become a source of distortion in conditions that are radically different from those. The social threats that your inner voice is detecting and amplifying are rarely as dangerous as the signals it sends would suggest. The mild disapproval of an acquaintance is not exclusion from the group. The awkward moment in a conversation is not a permanent judgment of your value. The decision by one person in one context to see you in a less than generous light is not a verdict on who you are, but the voice operating under old coding treats it as though it might be. It treats social friction as potentially catastrophic. It treats ambiguous signals from other people as probably negative. It treats its own interpretation of other people's inner states, which is, when you think about it, a particularly audacious kind of claim, since you cannot actually know what is happening in someone else's mind, as though those interpretations were established facts rather than stories built from partial information filtered through personal history. Epictetus spoke directly to this. He pointed out that we have no actual access to the inner lives of other people, what they think of us, whether they approve or disapprove, whether their expression of mild irritation represents a fundamental shift in how they regard us. These are things we cannot know, and yet we suffer over them as though we do know. We act as though we have read the verdict in a trial whose proceedings we were not even present for. We accept the sentence our own minds have invented and wonder why we feel imprisoned. The Stoic response to this is not indifference to other people. The Stoics were not individualists in the modern sense. They believed deeply in the reality of human connection, in the importance of community, in the obligations that people have to one another. What they were against was the specific kind of suffering that comes from over-indexing on what other people think, from allowing other people's actual or imagined opinions of you to determine the quality of your inner life, from outsourcing your sense of your own worth to the judgments of people who are themselves imperfect, limited, and working with incomplete information. Your worth, the Stoics would say, is not determined by opinion, not theirs, and not even yours. It is determined by your character, by the degree to which you act in accordance with your values, by the quality of your choices in the specific, concrete moments when choice is possible. And character is something you have direct access to. It is something you can observe clearly. It is something you can deliberately shape. Unlike the opinions of others which are outside your control, your own conduct is very much within it. And making your sense of worth dependent on what you can actually affect, rather than on what you cannot, is one of the most stabilizing shifts a human being can make. This does not mean you stop caring what anyone thinks. It means you stop treating what they think as the final authority on your value. You continue to be interested in feedback, in how your actions affect others, in whether the way you are showing up is aligned with the kind of person you want to be. Those things matter. They are valuable data. But they are data that you evaluate and respond to thoughtfully, not verdicts that you automatically accept and allow to determine how you feel about yourself. There is a particular kind of courage required to make this shift. It is not dramatic courage, not the courage of physical danger or grand sacrifice. It is a quieter kind. The courage to trust your own assessment of your own conduct, even when that assessment differs from the impression others are forming. The courage to disagree internally with the harsh verdict of the inner voice, even when that voice sounds very certain. The courage to act from your own values, even in situations where those around you would prefer something different from you. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this extensively because he faced it in a particularly acute form. As emperor, he was surrounded by people whose assessments of his decisions were motivated by their own interests, their own fears, their own desire for advantage. He could not simply defer to the approval of those around him, because that approval was not reliable. What he could defer to was the question, is this consistent with what I believe is right? Is this action one that I can defend on the basis of my own values, my own reason, my own understanding of what the situation requires? And when the answer was yes, that had to be enough, regardless of how it was received. Most of us will never face the precise pressures that Marcus faced, but the question is the same. Not, what will people think, but, is this what I actually believe is right? And am I willing to act on that belief, even in the presence of the voice that predicts the worst about how it will be received? The willingness to act from that place, from your own genuine assessment, rather than from the approval-seeking that the social mind tends toward, is one of the clearest markers of what it actually means to be free. Not free from D,